panels talking about how overwhelming corruption case, unsolved corruption case, and many amount of politicians who involved in a never-ending systematic corruption just really overwhelming, right? KPK or any kind of institution that have a responsibility to solve and investigate these issues also part of this kind of issues, right? Which lead to the normalization. We don't know who to trust in the government, something like that. But before going to my substantive, I would like to differentiate ourselves from the opening government. Three things about it. Number one, I think we want to differentiate it on how government is very lack on the characterization on corruption itself, how much the damage is really happening, and how it will be fulfilled in the form of justification. The second is how the government is very specific in aiming their goal on how they only want to protect the poor people, something like that, which we believe is not true, right? Simply because when talking about corruption, it will be very impactful to a lot of layers of society. And the last thing on the metrics of the justification on how it will be very justice, as simple they want to do reparation, something like that. I think that is not the only basic reason, right? On how the damage reason, on how the more parameter thing will be much better explained because government, and the last thing on social contracts on how government and society issues and trust itself will be much better explained outside of the house. And then go to the opposition side of the house. I think their case is very unclear in the mechanization, right? On how they are not able to prove to us how the rehabilitation really can solve the initiation to corrupt from this kind of corruptor itself. How the rehabilitation can fulfill the parameter of justice itself or the CGS they already been approved by the opening opposition. I think this kind of burden will be much better explained in my case, talking how about the protection, retribution, reparation, how will be much better explained in closing government. And the last thing on how talking about the government thing is also not really explaining close in opening opposition will become the burden of the closing governments. So go to the first thing I would like to talk about how the characterization of the corruption case itself. Number one, I think there is no morality in the corruption itself, right? The action of corruption is very systematic. It includes a lot of politicians and elitists, right? Means that in their action they have power and money to do so. But there will be two things. The one thing that is very problematic, that they are very aware and conscious about their action, but they start to choose to sacrifice this kind of morality in the self-purpose itself. Don't you think it will be bad? Because when you're talking about the morality in helping them or something like that, it also will not in line because they, since the beginning they already have no moral to do so. The second thing is, I think the damage given by this kind of actors is a lot, right? There's only not only quantifying that a lot of money that been taken away or something like that, but also in the form of unquantified damage itself. Talking about how when they take money from the social programs or something like that, don't you think it will be very impactful to the poor people, to a lot of people who need this kind of money? It leads to a lot of emotional damage, which is something that's not considered in the court itself, right? And this kind of thing will be very problematic. When also talking how the damage is also very long term, for example, how the case is really unsolved and the corruption still can exist. For example, corruption in Sianturi or Dana Hajis never really can be solved. And this kind of victim always asking for justice, and until now they still not able to do so. But this kind of corruptors already free from jail and they already able to do their happy life or something like that, right? Which is very bad in their side of the house. I think the last thing talking about the protection toward the society, imagine on how serial killer or something like that being punished and put in the jail, it will give a protection to the society itself, right? The more longer they in the jail, the more protection they get by the society because they feel scared. I think it will be in line when you're talking about the protection toward the society itself. When this kind of, in our side of the house, protection towards society exists as simple as this kind of corruption don't have any social power anymore. When you're talking about social power, it will be depend on the welfare of this kind of actors, right? When we take away all of the welfare, means they will have no power anymore. So the protection toward the society can be more achieved in our side of the house. And then let's move to my substantive. So the first thing, I would like to talk about how the context in status quo right now. Talking about the politician, talking about corruption is most likely to be done by politicians or elites who have money, right? There's a very massive amount of cases that are already always happening until status quo. So the first thing, I think in our side of the house, by do this kind of action, it will give a significant impact to this kind of character, right? It will change their behavior and their take away their welfare. Imagine on how you are as someone who get used to high class and then you put them into a situation living in a common situation, have no money or something like that. I think these kind of people not only will closer to the society, but at least they will understand how to be feel like in the living in the poor society or something like that, right? They will be more aware on what their action, they will be more regrettable in our side of the house. I think the second thing, I think we also show you a long-term impact on how doing this kind of corruption that will lead to the deterrent effect itself. I think the second thing, let's talking about the society have a very much big trust issues happening in status quo. Talking about how in talking about the corruption that's very overwhelmed or something like that, we will show you a power how we as a government really care about this kind of corruption issues, right? Let's talk about how a lot of corruption is never really solved. It takes a long time. There's no payback to this kind of people, and it's very problematic, right? And the society start to not really trusting in the government because they see government not able to solve this kind of issues. Government will not only get the harms, and also the society will become more likely to against the government because they are seeing this kind of government as an actor that cannot be reliable, right? There will be three things that happening if the trust issues happening. Number one, I think society tend to normalize this kind of action. They will start more likely to not really report. They will not against in this kind of corruption, or even they will try to jump in this kind of corruption because they see corruption is really beneficial for them, right? The second thing on how this kind of society tend not to trusting the policy making coming from the government itself because they see how this kind of government is not reliable and they cannot rely anymore to this kind of government. They will not doing any kind follow any kind of policy that made by the government. So it not only in the case of the corruption itself, but also it will be very impactful to the sustainability of the country as a whole itself. But just imagine you as a government make a policy, but your kind of society don't trust to you. What will happen is your policy will not work at the end of the day. And then the last thing, I think society will not to participate in repairing what actually happening. Right? Let's talk about corruption, create an unsustainability politics or something like that. They will tend to not care. They will just normalize it. They will not report or do anything because they see it's something that's very useless for them to do so. But compared to our side, when we do this kind of thing, what will happen? Number one, I think society will see this kind of thing as how government have a hard stand in solving the corruption itself. The second thing, it will prove to you on how then a lot of actors will be involved when you do this kind of corruption. There will be more larger punishment for you if you do bad things. And what will at the end of the day, what will happen outside of the house? Number one, society will tend to be aware of their action to do corruption or not. The second, society have a bigger likelihood to actively report this kind of case. And the last thing, society will trust the government, which can lead to a better policy, policy making or something like that we brought to against this question.
You hear?
Joyce.
Okay. Assuming this is still recording ya kan Kak?
Iya, still recording.
Okay, I will start.
Tunggu, ini di pause dulu.
No, just.
Pause.
Why? Panels. Let's start by distincting ourselves from opening debate, right? The fault of the opening debate is that there seems to be no consensus of who we should focus on in this debate. Opposition keeps talking about government role in sustaining these corruptors, while also at the same time sympathizing with the corruptors as if they were not guilty and actually cohesively not inherently doing what they need, are just doing what they need to do to survive. The government came in talking about impoverished people as if these corruptors being impoverished themselves will help the people into doing much better for themselves without actual characterization of what this impoverishment actually looks like and why it will support the people being much more better off. We believe that this debate should be brought from a more general standpoint in which not only towards the specific actors, but we believe that this debate should be brought from a standpoint that is every single one being affected by the corruptors, in which case not the issue of how it will affect people directly, but also on how this will affect corruption as a process in a whole. They don't have direct parameters of fairness and justice. They also don't have clear characterizations of what these actors and actions such as corruption and impoverishment to a clear degree that this debate could stand on. A member has spoken to you that government came to the debate saying that we're not going to fully impoverish them, saying that this stance is not only weak but also not accurate towards what the debate wanted. Members also explained about how the opposition on the other hand came to the debate with the basic assumption that we need to solve is the root issue without actual characterization of that root issue and why. Rehab is something that is going to solve this issue. They also don't give actual distinction about social justice system and how this is not inherently applicable towards corruption that is such a much larger scale. And also lacking on the necessary explanation of why repercussion and why reintegration is something that is necessary for them comparatively towards repercussion. Comparatively, only our side actually managed to prove to you why this is going to be much better in solving corruption, actually explaining the root of corruption, in which case that there is a chance and gap for them to do that corruption. We explained the danger, the damage to society by corruption and the impact it has if we actually pursue this policy, and at the end, why ultimately corruption is something that is so detrimental that this in fact deserves a harsher punishment rather than just jail and just rehabilitation at the end. But also notice that one of the most important characterizations is that we are the only team actually talking about how this will affect the people's stances on the fight against corruption. At the end, we're the only team able to explain to you why it's not only the people directly affected by corruption that's important in this debate, but also about how the people see the whole government and the fight against corruption as something that is inherently ineffective, and how this policy will just push to further the progress of this movement itself, right? First thing, let's compare principality on both sides of the benches, right? Our side simply says that members has explained to you why the impact of people, why the impact on these corruptors will not only affect them in economical way, in which case they will lose their money, but also give them social and mental sanction, in which now they're living in a condition that they are not accustomed to, in which they will less likely to actually pursue corruption in a much more further stances as they progress in their life. Notice that this is something that is important in a way that the impact that they actually have isn't only in economical way, but also in something that is much more detrimental towards them, and making sure that they are stopping to actually doing these corrupt things. Secondly, we also have explained to you why the people will see this as a reform towards a cleaner government, right? Notice that extending on the member cases, notice that the people in status quo really don't care about what government do to corruptors. People are really disinterested because they think that corruptors will get what they want because they have the government and lawmaker in their pocket and whatnot. That means that people will not inherently care about what is being done with the nation money itself. This inherently makes it so that isn't to say this is particularly important when you notice that this creates disinterest in moving against corruption. This disinterest is important because if this policy is being pushed and we can expect a return in this interest from the people itself, it isn't to say that the people will now have direct power against corruption, but they will have, which is much more important, an extension of their power towards fighting corruption by way of the government doing what they want. The government now will be seen as a proxy for them to combat corruption, which this will make the people more likely to, one, notice corruption. That means that supervision from society will be much more stronger. That means the government will also more likely to hearing people's speeches and making a better decision for this corruption, and also pursuing crime reformation in general. This will push a reform in a way that the government will be more inclined to pursue a full fight against corruption, which is something that only our side can actually provide you as something that is something that is beneficial towards the debate. Notice on their side, they say that they may be poor, they may be in a poor country, then it's more justified to be corrupt because it sustains them, it's necessary. We don't think that the idea of coming from an impoverished country is enough of a justification for them to continue impoverishing other people. Being in harm yourself doesn't mean that you're liable to not be achieving in any form of repercussion. Even if you are in a poor country, if you do crimes, you should pay that crime and do still. The payment that needs to be given isn't particularly an idea that jail is enough and whatnot. We stand by opening government saying that in the status quo it just slaps in the wrist. But extending more on this is that why jail and rehab isn't enough. For one, the idea that jail is a form of repercussion isn't enough. Because for one, not only does jail doesn't work, in which case it's just a formality, is that these types of repercussion is just actually going to push them towards corrupting more, especially now that they are in a place where they have full power, in which case jail, they have external power towards external actors that have the same power as them. Why is it then that rehab in comparison isn't enough? We explain that rehab isn't always eligible to solve a certain crime. We say that this may not be what they intended to. Rehab only works when the people are actually having an acute problem that rehab still needs to solve. Corruption isn't particularly the same as these crimes such as like drug usage. Corruption is a decision that you take rationally, in which case knowing the consequences, but being interested more in the benefit that you will gain. That means that talking about justification, it doesn't matter where those corruptors come from and how much money they take. As long as they're taking it unjustly, we need to actually give them repercussion, in which case we need to actually impoverish them because this is the only justifiable thing to do. Secondly, they say that the government will have too much burden to sustain these ex-corruptors. We say a clear no to this because at the end of the day, this is no one at all's burden to actually pursue. If people are impoverished in the status quo, they are impoverished and they have to actually sustain themselves. At best, what the government do is they just give them some sort of like subsidize and give them a financial gain and whatnot, which is very incremental and not at all enough to sustain the living condition that they had in the past. At the end, the idea of burden towards government probably is to the extent that this ex-corruptor will be a poor family, right? The trade-off then is simple. What would be more justifiable? Helping one family who are poor because they're corrupt, or helping thousands of families who are poor because the corruptor is being given the free rein to do what they are actually doing? At the end of the day, we believe that the concept of family being burden itself is not inherently going to be in line what they need. At the worst case, where this is unjustified, the trade-off is that you think about the impact towards the family of corruptors, which is unjustified, and you are going to actually trade off the people who are not actually in a line of way that they are corrupting. They are in which they are poor because of the corruptors itself. In which case, this is not something that is justifiable, and we do believe that we are very proud to oppose.